The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered barn walls as Margaret Chen stepped inside, dust motes dancing in the pale October light. She'd bought this crumbling structure on the outskirts of Millbrook for practically nothing, just somewhere to store Tom's farming equipment after his sudden heart attack 6 months ago. But as she moved deeper into the shadows, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. Kneeling down, she pried it up with her fingers, expecting to find rotted wood underneath. Instead, her breath caught. Below was a metal box, and inside it, photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like a woman's jewelry. The headlines made her blood run cold. Local teacher vanishes without trace. 1987. The same year she and Tom had moved to Millbrook. The same year he'd insisted they buy their farm from old Henry Caldwell, the barn's previous owner. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the evidence spread before her. Her husband, the gentle man she'd loved for 35 years, had taken this secret to his grave. But why would Tom help hide a murder? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret sank back onto her heels, the dusty barn floor cold beneath her knees. The October afternoon light seemed to dim as she studied the contents of the metal box more carefully. The newspaper clipping was yellowed with age, but the black and white photograph accompanying the article showed a young woman with kind eyes and shoulder-length auburn hair, Sarah Brennan, age 26, elementary school teacher, beloved by her students and colleagues. The article detailed how Sarah had simply vanished one evening in November 1987. Her car was found abandoned on Route 9, keys still in the ignition, purse left behind. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. The investigation had gone cold within months, leaving Sarah's family with nothing but questions and grief. Margaret's fingers hovered over the other items in the box, a delicate gold locket with the initials SB engraved on the front. Several more newspaper clippings tracking the investigation's progress, or lack thereof, over the following months. And photographs. Margaret's stomach lurched as she realized what they depicted. The pictures showed this very barn, but from years past when it was in better condition. In one photo, she could make out 2 figures near what appeared to be a freshly dug area behind the structure. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but one of the figures looked unmistakably like a younger Tom. The other was harder to discern, a tall, heavy-set man she didn't recognize. Margaret set the photographs down with shaking hands. She thought back to those early years in Millbrook, when Tom had been so eager to establish himself in the farming community. He'd spoken often of Henry Caldwell, the elderly man who'd sold them their property. Tom had always described Henry as a mentor, someone who'd helped him navigate the complexities of rural life and agricultural business. But now she remembered other things, the late-night conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room, the way Tom would sometimes drive out to check on the old Caldwell place even though they had no business there, his insistence that they never use the barn on their own property, claiming it was structurally unsound, even though it had seemed perfectly serviceable to her. A gust of wind rattled the barn walls, and Margaret startled. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the interior. She needed to get home, needed time to process what she'd discovered. But first, she had to secure this evidence. As she carefully placed the items back in the metal box, her mind raced with possibilities. Had Tom been involved in Sarah Brennan's disappearance? Or had he simply stumbled upon evidence after the fact and chosen to protect Henry Caldwell? The Tom she'd known was incapable of violence, but he was also fiercely loyal to those he considered family. Margaret remembered how devastated Tom had been when Henry passed away 5 years ago. He'd insisted on serving as a pallbearer, had spoken movingly at the funeral about Henry's character and generosity, but what if that loyalty had come at a terrible cost? She tucked the metal box under her arm and made her way toward the barn door. Tomorrow she would need to decide what to do with this information. Sarah Brennan's family deserved answers, deserved closure after more than 3 decades of uncertainty. But pursuing those answers might destroy everything Margaret thought she knew about her marriage, her life, and the man she'd mourned for the past 6 months. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret walked slowly toward her truck, the weight of the metal box nothing compared to the burden of knowledge she now carried. Whatever secrets lay buried in Millbrook's past, she was now their reluctant keeper. The drive home through the quiet countryside felt longer than usual, each mile heavy with the weight of discovery and the terrible question that would haunt her dreams: what other secrets had Tom taken to his grave? The afternoon sun filtered through the gaps in the barn's weathered siding as Margaret surveyed the task ahead of her. She'd driven back to the property with her Honda Civic packed to the brim with cleaning supplies, a space heater, and several boxes of Robert's belongings that she couldn't bear to keep looking at in the house. The barn was supposed to be her solution, a place to store the remnants of their 43-year marriage until she could decide what to do with them. The real estate agent, Janet Holbrook, had been apologetic about the barn's condition when she'd shown Margaret the property 6 weeks ago. "It's really just the land you're buying," Janet had explained, stepping carefully around a pile of mouldering hay. "The barn's probably more trouble than it's worth. Most folks would tear it down." But Margaret had seen potential in the solid bone structure of the building, and more importantly, she'd seen privacy, no neighbors peering over fences, wondering why the widow Morrison was hauling boxes around at all hours. Now, standing in the musty interior with its cathedral ceiling disappearing into shadows, Margaret wondered if Janet had been right. The barn was larger than she'd remembered, maybe 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a hayloft running along one side. Ancient farming equipment lurked in corners like sleeping beasts. A rusted plow, what looked like parts of an old threshing machine, several mysterious contraptions she couldn't identify. She started with the obvious debris, filling garbage bags with rotted rope, broken tools, and fragments of machinery that had succumbed to decades of neglect. The work was oddly therapeutic. Each bag she dragged outside felt like progress, like clearing space not just in the barn but in her mind. It was while wrestling a particularly stubborn piece of equipment away from the wall that she first noticed the irregularity. The barn's interior walls were lined with vertical boards, weathered grey and warped with age, but mostly uniform, except for one section near the back corner, where the boards seemed newer, their grain running in a slightly different direction. Margaret set down the rusted cultivator she'd been moving and approached the wall for a closer look. The difference was subtle. She might not have noticed it if the late afternoon light hadn't been hitting the wood at just the right angle. Someone had replaced a section of the original siding, perhaps 6 feet wide and running from floor to ceiling. The replacement boards had been stained to match the originals, but time and weather affected different wood differently. What had once been camouflaged was now clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. She ran her fingers along the edge where the old wood met the new. There was definitely a seam there, though it had been carefully disguised. More interesting was what she found at eye level, a small gap between 2 boards, just wide enough to slip her fingers through. When she pressed against the boards, they gave slightly, as if they weren't solidly attached to the wall frame behind them. Margaret glanced toward the barn's open doors, suddenly aware of how isolated the property was. The nearest house was a quarter-mile away, hidden behind a stand of oak trees. She'd thought the privacy was a blessing, but now it felt different. The barn seemed to hold its breath around her, waiting. She returned to her car and retrieved a flashlight from the emergency kit Robert had always insisted she carry. Back at the wall, she clicked on the beam and aimed it through the gap between the boards. The light revealed empty space beyond, not just the exterior wall but an actual room. Her heart began to beat faster. She wedged her fingers into the gap and pulled. The entire section of board swung toward her like a door, hinges creaking with disuse. Cool air flowed out of the opening, carrying a smell that made her step back, something sweet and cloying and wrong. The flashlight beam revealed a space about the size of a large closet, maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep. The floor was bare earth, packed hard as concrete. Against the far wall sat a wooden crate, the kind used for shipping heavy equipment. Next to it was a folding chair and a card table, both filmed with dust but in remarkably good condition, considering the barn's general state of decay. Margaret played the flashlight beam across every inch of the hidden room before stepping inside. The sweet smell was stronger here, though she couldn't identify its source. She approached the wooden crate first, noting that its lid wasn't nailed down but simply resting in place. When she lifted one corner, the smell intensified dramatically. Inside the crate, wrapped in what had once been a blue plastic tarp, were bones. Human bones, yellowed with age but unmistakably real. A skull stared up at her with empty sockets, and scattered around it were the smaller bones of hands and feet, along with fragments of clothing that had survived better than the flesh they'd once covered. Margaret dropped the lid and stumbled backward, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The morning light filtered through the barn's weathered boards as Margaret returned with a borrowed generator and work lamp from her neighbor, Tom. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through what she'd discovered in that hidden room. The manila envelope sat unopened on her kitchen table. She hadn't been able to bring herself to examine its contents in the dim light of her phone's flashlight. The generator coughed to life on the third pull, filling the barn with mechanical noise that somehow made the space feel less ominous. Margaret had always preferred working with her hands when her thoughts grew tangled, and today was no exception. She needed to see everything clearly before deciding what to do next. The work lamp cast harsh shadows as she descended into the hidden room. In the stark light, the space felt smaller but more defined. The wooden shelves lined 3 walls, and she could now see that someone had taken great care in organizing whatever had been stored here. Dust patterns on the shelves suggested boxes or containers had sat in precise rows, removed sometime in the past. But not everything was gone. Margaret knelt beside a metal filing cabinet she'd missed in the darkness. The top drawer stuck, warped with age and moisture, but yielded with a sharp tug. Inside, manila folders hung in neat rows, most empty now, but a few still contained documents. She lifted out the first file and opened it on the floor beside her. Property records, deeds and surveys dating back to the 1970s, all bearing the signature of Harold Whitman, the barn's previous owner. But there were other names too, some she recognized from the small town. Her heart stuttered when she saw Richard's neat handwriting in the margins of several documents, notes about property lines and easements. Nothing suspicious in itself. Richard had done legal work for half the county, but the dates gave her pause. These were from 1982, the same year as the newspaper clippings. The second folder contained correspondence, letters between Harold Whitman and various parties about property disputes, a few complaints about teenagers trespassing, and then, Margaret's breath caught, a letter from the county sheriff's office about the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Jessica Hartley. Jessica Hartley, finally, a name. The letter, dated November 15th, 1982, was brief and formal, asking Whitman to contact the department if he recalled anything else about the night of October 8th. Margaret grabbed the newspaper clippings from the envelope she'd brought down with her and found the date that had been circled in red ink, October 8th, 1982. Her hands trembled as she read the sheriff's letter again. Someone had written in pencil along the margin, "R says keep quiet. No one else needs to know about the room. R. Richard." Margaret sank back against the wall, the letter clutched in her hands. The logical part of her mind tried to construct innocent explanations. Perhaps Richard had simply advised his client about legal rights, about when cooperation with police was mandatory versus voluntary. But the secrecy of this room, the careful concealment, suggested something far more troubling. She forced herself to continue searching. The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet held a wooden box about the size of a jewelry case. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that might once have been white, was a gold bracelet. Delicate, feminine, with a small charm dangling from it, a tiny ballet slipper. Margaret held it up to the light and her stomach lurched. She'd seen this bracelet before, or one exactly like it, In the newspaper photo, Jessica Hartley had been wearing jewelry, though the grainy black and white image made details difficult to distinguish. But this looked like something a young woman in 1982 might wear. The sound of footsteps above made her freeze. Heavy boots crossing the barn floor, heading directly toward the trapdoor. Margaret quickly closed the box and slipped it into her jacket pocket, her heart hammering. She grabbed the files and envelope, switched off the work lamp, and waited. "Mrs. Whitten?" The voice was male, unfamiliar. "Your neighbor said you might be out here." Margaret climbed the ladder, emerging into the barn to find a tall man in his 50s, wearing a deputy sheriff's uniform. His badge read Thompson, and his expression was carefully neutral. "Deputy Thompson," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "I heard you'd purchased the Whitman property. Just wanted to stop by and introduce myself, see how you're settling in." His eyes swept the barn, lingering on the generator and the open trap door. "Doing some renovation work?" "Just exploring," Margaret said. "Old buildings like this, you never know what you'll find." Something flickered in Thompson's expression. "No, you certainly don't. Mind if I ask what you've found so far?" The weight of the bracelet in her pocket felt enormous. Margaret forced a smile. Mostly just dust and mouse droppings. Nothing terribly exciting. Thompson nodded slowly, but his gaze remained sharp. "Well, if you do come across anything unusual, anything that might be of historical interest, I'd appreciate a call. Small towns like ours, we like to preserve our history." The way he emphasized anything unusual made Margaret's skin crawl. The morning light filtered through the barn's warped boards as Margaret stood before the hidden room, coffee growing cold in her hands. She'd barely slept, her mind churning over the implications of what she'd found. The photograph of the young woman haunted her. Those eyes seemed to follow her even in darkness. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped back into the concealed space. In daylight, filtered though it was, she could see more clearly. The room was larger than she'd initially thought, extending back into what must have been carved-out earth behind the barn's original foundation. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to create this hiding place. Margaret set down her coffee and began examining the contents more systematically. The cardboard boxes were damp but intact, their contents protected by plastic bags. The first box contained more photographs, some of the same dark-haired woman, others of different people she didn't recognize. All appeared to be from the late 1980s or early 1990s, judging by the clothing and photo quality. The second box made her hands tremble. Police reports, photocopied and meticulously organized. Missing person reports for Jennifer Lynn Hartwell, age 23, last seen leaving her job at Millfield Community Bank on October 15, 1991. Margaret's breath caught. She remembered that case vaguely. It had been in the papers for weeks, search parties combing the surrounding woods and farmland. But Jennifer Hartwell was never found. Margaret's fingers traced the photocopied pages, noting handwritten notes in margins. The handwriting was neat, methodical, familiar. Her stomach dropped as recognition dawned. She'd seen that precise script countless times over 30 years of marriage, on shopping lists, birthday cards, and work notes left on the kitchen counter. Richard's handwriting. She sank onto an overturned crate, the reports scattered across her lap. Why would Richard have copies of police reports about a missing woman? Why hide them in a secret room? The questions multiplied faster than she could process them. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages. This one was different, taken outdoors, showing Jennifer Hartwell standing next to a familiar blue sedan. Margaret's blood turned to ice. That car. She remembered that car. Richard had driven that exact model and color in the early 90s before trading it in for the truck he'd kept until his death. With shaking hands, she reached for the third box. Inside, wrapped in an old towel, was a woman's purse. Brown leather, worn but well-maintained. Margaret opened it carefully, as if it might disintegrate at her touch. A wallet contained Jennifer Hartwell's driver's license, credit cards, and $43 in cash. Everything a woman would never leave behind voluntarily. The implications hit her like physical blows. This wasn't just hidden evidence, this was a crime scene. Someone had killed Jennifer Hartwell, and somehow, impossibly, Richard had been involved in covering it up. But how? Why? The man she'd known, the man she'd loved and trusted, couldn't have been capable of such deception. Could he? Margaret forced herself to continue searching. At the bottom of the third box, beneath the purse, she found a manila envelope sealed with tape yellowed by age. Her name was written across it in Richard's careful script. For Margaret, if something happens to me. Her hands shook so violently she could barely work the tape loose. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Richard's handwriting filling both sides in dense paragraphs. She had to read the first lines 3 times before they registered. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally surfaced. I pray it never comes to that, but I can't carry this burden to my grave without giving you the chance to understand. I need you to know that I never killed anyone, but I helped hide the truth, and that makes me guilty of something almost as terrible. The letter went on to explain how Richard's brother Dale had called him in a panic that October night in 1991. There'd been an accident, Dale claimed. Jennifer Hartwell had been arguing with her boyfriend near the old quarry road. The boyfriend had pushed her. She'd fallen and struck her head on rocks. He'd panicked and called Dale, who'd called Richard. By the time I got there, she was already dead, Richard had written. Dale said the boyfriend was a prominent businessman's son, that his life would be ruined over what was really just a tragic accident. I should have called the police immediately. Instead, I helped them move her body, make it disappear. The boyfriend paid us both to stay quiet. I told myself we were protecting a young man's future over something that couldn't be undone anyway. But the final paragraph changed everything. I learned years later that it wasn't an accident. The boyfriend had been violent before. Jennifer had been planning to leave him, and he couldn't let that happen. We didn't cover up an accident, Margaret. We covered up a murder. And now that man has built an empire on the foundation of our silence. The letter wasn't signed, but at the bottom, Richard had written an address. Margaret's hands trembled as she dialed Detective Walsh's number, but when his voicemail picked up, she hung up without leaving a message. What would she say? That she'd found evidence her dead husband might have covered up a murder? The words seemed too surreal to speak aloud. She returned to the barn the next morning with a portable lamp and her late husband's old toolbox. If there were more secrets hidden in that room, she needed to find them before involving the police. The morning mist clung to the fields around the property, making the barn seem even more isolated and foreboding. Inside the hidden room, Margaret methodically examined every inch of the walls and floor. The newspaper clippings about Jennifer Hayes' disappearance were spread across the workbench like pieces of a puzzle. The girl had vanished on a Friday night in October 1987, just 2 weeks before Margaret and David's wedding. That detail hit her like a physical blow. She sank onto the wooden crate, trying to reconcile the timeline. David had been distant those final weeks before their wedding, claiming work stress. She'd attributed it to pre-wedding jitters and the pressure of his new position at the county planning office. But now those memories took on a sinister quality. Margaret picked up the manila folder again, studying David's handwriting more carefully. The notes were cryptic, addresses, dates, and what appeared to be meeting times. One address was circled multiple times, 1247 Elm Street. She recognized it immediately. That was where the Hayeses had lived. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Sarah. Mom, found Dad's old appointment books while cleaning out the garage. Want me to drop them off? Margaret stared at the message, her heart racing. Yes, please bring them by the barn. 20 minutes later, Sarah's car pulled up the gravel drive. Margaret quickly locked the hidden room and met her daughter outside, accepting 3 worn leather appointment books from the late 1980s. I almost threw these away, Sarah said, studying her mother's face. Mom, you look terrible. Are you sleeping? Just tired from all the sorting. Margaret forced a smile. These might help me figure out what to do with some of Dad's business papers. After Sarah left, Margaret returned to the hidden room and opened David's 1987 appointment book with shaking fingers. She flipped to October, scanning the entries. October 12th, Jennifer's disappearance date, showed only JH 8 p.m. written in David's careful script. JH Jennifer Hayes. Margaret's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her. David had met with Jennifer the night she disappeared. But why? What possible connection could her husband have had with a 17-year-old girl? She forced herself to keep reading. The days following Jennifer's disappearance were filled with unusual entries. RM, midnight, clear sight, dawn and final payment, $5,000. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, as if written under stress. RM could be Robert Morrison, she realized with growing horror. She'd heard that name recently. Wasn't he the contractor who'd built their house? David had always praised Morrison's discretion and reliability, claiming he was the only builder who could handle complicated projects. Margaret photographed every page with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she had to retake several shots. Then she noticed something else in the folder, a small key taped to the inside back cover. It was brass, old-fashioned, with numbers engraved on it, 247, a safety deposit box key. The weight of her discovery settled over her like a suffocating blanket. David hadn't just known about Jennifer Hayes' murder. His careful documentation suggested he'd been intimately involved in covering it up. The hidden room wasn't just a storage space, it was an insurance policy, a record of his involvement in case he ever needed leverage. But leverage against whom? Who else was involved? Margaret's phone rang, startling her. Detective Walsh's name appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Chen, I got a missed call from your number yesterday." Her mouth went dry. "Yes, I found something at the property. Something you might want to see." "What kind of something?" Margaret looked around the hidden room, at the newspapers, the photographs, the evidence of her husband's guilt. Once she spoke, there would be no taking it back. David's reputation, their family's legacy, Sarah's memories of her father, everything would be destroyed. "Mrs. Chen, are you there?" "I'm here. It's about the Hayes case. Jennifer Hayes." The silence stretched for so long, Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. "I'll be there in an hour," Walsh finally said, his voice sharp with interest. Margaret ended the call and stared at the appointment book in her hands. In 1 hour, Detective Walsh would see the evidence, but first she needed to visit First National Bank and find out what secrets David had locked away in safety deposit box 247. The morning mist had lifted, but Margaret felt more lost than ever. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the photograph under the barn's harsh fluorescent light. The woman in the picture couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair swept back in the style of the early 80s and kind eyes that seemed to look directly at Margaret across the decades. On the back, someone had written Sarah Chen, 1983, in careful block letters. The name meant nothing to her, but something about the woman's face stirred an uncomfortable recognition. Margaret had seen those features before, though she couldn't place where. She set the photo aside and returned to the metal box, her fingers working through yellowed newspaper clippings with growing unease. "Local woman missing," read the headline from the Millbrook Gazette, dated September 15, 1983. The article described Sarah Chen as a graduate student at the nearby university, last seen leaving the campus library on a Tuesday evening. Her car had been found abandoned 3 days later at Miller's Point, a scenic overlook 20 miles outside town. The article mentioned that Sarah had been working on her thesis about local environmental practices and had been asking questions about industrial waste disposal in the area. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas had worked for Hartwell Industries back then, the largest chemical plant in the county. He'd started there right after college, fresh-faced and eager to make his mark in environmental engineering. It was where they'd met, actually. She'd been working in the administrative offices while putting herself through night school. She rifled through more clippings. The story had made headlines for weeks, but the trail went cold quickly. The police had initially suspected suicide, given the location where the car was found, but Sarah's family insisted she would never have taken her own life. A few articles mentioned that Sarah had been asking pointed questions about certain companies' waste management practices, but no specific names were given. At the bottom of the box, Margaret found a manila envelope sealed with brittle tape. Inside were photocopies of documents, internal memos from Hartwell Industries dated from the summer of 1983. Her heart sank as she recognized the company letterhead, the same logo that had appeared on Thomas's paychecks for over a decade. The memos detailed concerns about improper disposal of chemical waste. Someone had been dumping barrels of toxic material in unauthorized locations, falsifying disposal records, and paying off inspectors to look the other way. The documents were damning, the kind of evidence that could have destroyed the company and sent several executives to prison. Thomas's name appeared on 3 of the memos, his signature, young and slightly different from the one she knew, but unmistakably his. He'd been questioning the disposal practices, raising red flags about environmental contamination. According to the documents, he'd been preparing a comprehensive report for the State Environmental Agency. Margaret sat back on her heels, the implications washing over her like ice water. Sarah Chen had been investigating illegal dumping. Thomas had discovered the same practices from the inside. And then Sarah had vanished. And based on what Margaret remembered of Thomas's career, he'd stopped asking uncomfortable questions and had been promoted to a management position within 6 months. She thought back to that period of their relationship. Thomas had been different in late 1983, withdrawn, drinking more than usual, working late nights. She'd attributed it to stress from his new responsibilities at work. He'd gotten a raise that winter, enough for them to put a down payment on their first house. She'd been so grateful then, so proud of his success. Now she wondered what price that success had come at. A sound outside made her freeze, the crunch of gravel under tires. Margaret quickly gathered the documents and photos, stuffing them back into the box. She switched off the fluorescent light and peered through a gap in the barn's weathered siding. A dark sedan was parked at the end of her driveway, its engine running. She couldn't make out the driver through the tinted windows, but something about the car's deliberate positioning, facing away from the house, ready for a quick exit, made her pulse quicken. After several long minutes, the car pulled away without anyone getting out. Margaret waited until she could no longer hear the engine before she dared to move. Her hands were shaking again as she carefully closed the metal box and looked around the hidden room. Someone knew she was here. Someone knew she'd found the room, found the evidence. The same someone who had convinced Thomas to stop asking questions 40 years ago, who had made Sarah Chen disappear when she got too close to the truth. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she was now walking the same dangerous path that had cost Sarah her life. The question was whether she had the courage to see it through, or if she would meet the same fate as the young woman whose kind eyes stared back at her from a photograph that should never have existed. Margaret's hands trembled as she spread the photographs across her kitchen table, the morning light casting harsh shadows across the grainy black and white images. Sleep had eluded her completely, and now in the unforgiving daylight, the evidence seemed even more damning. The man in the background of 3 separate crime scene photos bore an unmistakable resemblance to David, though the images were taken years before she'd even met him. She picked up her coffee mug, realized it had gone cold hours ago, and set it down with a sharp clink. The sound echoed through the empty house, amplifying her isolation. Every familiar object around her seemed foreign now. The kitchen clock David had insisted on hanging precisely there, the ceramic fruit bowl they'd bought together on their honeymoon, the stack of his medical journals she'd never had the heart to throw away. Had any of it been real? The doorbell's chime made her jump, scattering several photos to the floor. Through the front window's sheer curtains, she could make out Detective Harrison's imposing silhouette. Margaret quickly gathered the scattered evidence, her pulse hammering against her throat. She couldn't let him see these, not yet, not until she understood what they meant. "Mrs. Chen, I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." Harrison's voice carried that practiced tone of authority softened with false concern. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his sharp eyes already scanning the living room. I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Sometimes people remember additional details after our initial discussion. Margaret forced herself to breathe normally, acutely aware of the kitchen table just 20 feet away, where David's potential secrets lay exposed. Of course, Detective, though I'm afraid I haven't recalled anything new. Can I offer you coffee? That would be appreciated. He followed her toward the kitchen, and Margaret's stomach lurched. She positioned herself deliberately between Harrison and the table, reaching for a clean mug with hands she willed to steady. You mentioned your husband was a medical professional, Harrison said, settling into a chair that faced away from the evidence. Margaret silently thanked whatever guardian angel was watching over her. Did he ever mention treating any unusual injuries? Perhaps someone who came in asking for discretion? The coffee pot slipped slightly in Margaret's grip. David respected patient confidentiality very seriously. He rarely discussed his work at home. The lie tasted bitter, mixing with the acid already churning in her stomach. David had actually talked frequently about interesting cases, though he'd always been careful to protect patient identities. Of course, professional ethics. Harrison accepted the steaming mug with a nod. Though sometimes doctors encounter situations that trouble them. Maybe your husband seemed particularly stressed during certain periods? Changed his routine unexpectedly? Margaret's mind raced through memories she'd never questioned before. David's sudden decision to take that 3-week fishing trip to Canada in 1987, just months after they'd married. His insistence on handling all their financial records personally. The way he'd sometimes fallen silent mid-conversation, staring at nothing with an expression she'd attributed to the weight of his medical responsibilities. Detective, why are you asking these specific questions? She sat across from him, grateful the table's width provided some barrier. Yesterday you seemed more interested in the barn's history. Harrison's grey eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. We're exploring all angles, Mrs. Chen. Sometimes seemingly unconnected events reveal patterns. Your husband purchased that barn in 1989, correct? That was relatively soon after the Whitmore case went cold. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow, though she fought to keep her expression neutral. Whitmore. She'd seen that name scrawled in David's handwriting on one of the newspaper clippings. I'm not familiar with any Whitmore case. Sarah Whitmore, 23 years old, disappeared from a local bar in late 1988. Her body was discovered 6 months later, but by then the crime scene was too contaminated for a proper investigation. The case file mentioned several potential witnesses who later recanted their statements or simply vanished. Margaret gripped her coffee mug tighter. That sounds terrible, but I don't see how it relates to David or myself. Probably doesn't, Harrison said easily, but his casual tone felt calculated, just covering our bases. Though I find it interesting that someone went to considerable trouble to hide that room in your barn. That kind of concealment takes planning, resources, the work of someone with something significant to protect. The detective finished his coffee and stood, leaving Margaret feeling simultaneously relieved and more anxious than before. If you do happen to remember anything unusual about your husband's behavior, any unexplained absences or changes in routine, please don't hesitate to call. He placed his business card on the counter, directly beside where the hidden photographs lay just beneath a dish towel. After his departure, Margaret remained frozen at the kitchen table, afraid to move the towel aside and confront what she'd discovered. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows like restless spirits demanding entry. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the photograph up to the barn's dusty light, filtering through the broken slats. The image was faded but unmistakable, a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing a yellow sundress. The same woman from the driver's license she'd found days earlier, Sarah Chen, age 23. But this photograph was different. It wasn't a formal portrait or identification photo. This was personal, intimate. Sarah was laughing, her head thrown back in joy, and beside her stood a man with his arm around her waist. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar jawline, the way his left shoulder dipped slightly lower than his right, a characteristic she'd attributed to years of carrying his heavy tool bag. It was David, her David, 25 years younger but undeniably him. The photo slipped from her numb fingers, floating down to land among the other scattered contents of the metal box she'd discovered wedged behind a loose board in the hidden room. Her knees gave way and she sank to the floor, staring at the evidence surrounding her like pieces of a puzzle she desperately didn't want to solve. There were more photographs. David and Sarah at what looked like a county fair, sharing cotton candy. David and Sarah by a lake, her hand resting on his chest. David and Sarah in what appeared to be this very barn, back when it was whole and functional, golden hay bales stacked behind them. Margaret picked up a folded piece of paper, her movements mechanical. The handwriting was feminine, looping letters in blue ink. "My dearest David," it began, "I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. I know you're scared, but we can figure this out together. The baby changes everything, but it doesn't have to change us. I love you, we love you, please call me S." The paper crumpled in Margaret's fist as a sob escaped her throat. A baby. Sarah had been pregnant. The medical examiner's report she'd found earlier suddenly made horrific sense. The victim had been approximately 6 weeks pregnant at the time of death. She forced herself to examine the remaining contents of the box. A small jewelry box containing a simple silver necklace with an S pendant, a ticket stub from a movie dated 3 months before Sarah's disappearance, and at the bottom, a small appointment card from Dr. Patricia Weinstein, OBGYN, with Sarah's name written in the patient slot. Margaret's mind raced, connecting dots she wished would remain forever separate. David had been having an affair. Sarah had gotten pregnant. And then Sarah had disappeared, her body ending up in the hidden room of this barn, the barn David had insisted they never needed to visit, despite it being on the route to his mother's house. The sound of gravel crunching outside made her freeze. A car door slammed, followed by heavy footsteps approaching the barn. Margaret quickly gathered the photographs and papers, shoving them back into the metal box. She had just managed to push the box behind the loose board when Detective Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hartwell, I saw your car outside." His voice carried a note of suspicion. "What brings you back here?" Margaret wiped her eyes quickly, hoping he wouldn't notice her distress. I found some more of David's things. I wasn't sure if they might be relevant to your investigation." Rodriguez stepped closer, his experienced eyes taking in her disheveled appearance, the dust on her clothes, the way her hands shook slightly. "What kind of things?" She hesitated. Every instinct told her to protect David's memory, to keep his secrets buried with him. But Sarah Chen deserved justice. Her family deserved answers, and Margaret couldn't live with this knowledge alone. "I think you should see for yourself," she said quietly, moving toward the hidden room. Rodriguez followed, his expression growing more serious as she led him to the loose board. She pulled out the metal box with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I found this wedged back there," she said, opening the lid. The detective's eyes widened as he saw the photographs. He pulled on latex gloves and carefully lifted each item, studying them with practiced attention. When he reached the love letter, his jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said slowly, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did you know about your husband's relationship with Sarah Chen?" Margaret shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "I had no idea. I thought we were happy. We'd been married for 15 years when she disappeared. I never suspected—" Rodriguez nodded sympathetically, but she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was no longer just investigating a cold case. He was building a murder case against a dead man. "I'm going to need you to come to the station to give a formal statement," he said. "And Mrs. Hartwell? I strongly advise you to contact a lawyer." The weight of those words settled over Margaret like a shroud. Her husband hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been a killer. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the photograph under the barn's harsh work light. The young woman's face stared back at her, beautiful, hopeful, alive. But it was the handwriting on the back that made her blood run cold. Sarah, 1987, love always D. David's handwriting. She'd recognize it anywhere after 35 years of marriage. The hidden room suddenly felt suffocating. Margaret stumbled backward, knocking over the metal box she'd been searching through, its contents scattered across the dirt floor, more photographs, letters, and what looked like a driver's license. She bent to retrieve the license, her vision blurring as she read the name, Sarah Elizabeth Caldwell. The missing girl from 1987, the one whose disappearance had dominated local news for months before being relegated to cold case files. Margaret remembered the search parties, the tearful interviews with Sarah's parents, the gradual fading of hope, as weeks turned to months with no trace. But David had known her well enough to exchange love notes. Margaret's mind reeled as she gathered the scattered items. How many times had David come home late in 1987, claiming overtime at the construction company? How many evenings had he been distant, distracted, when she'd attributed his mood to work stress? They'd been married only 3 years then, still learning each other's rhythms and secrets. Apparently, some secrets ran deeper than others. A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps crunched on gravel, approaching the barn. Margaret quickly shoved the photographs and license into her jacket pocket and switched off the work light. The hidden room plunged into darkness just as the barn's main door creaked open. "Mrs. Morrison, you in here?" It was Deputy Collins, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself against the wall of the hidden room, praying he wouldn't notice the open panel. Through the gap she could see his flashlight beam sweeping across the barn's interior. "Saw your car outside," he called. "Just wanted to check everything was all right. Been some break-ins in the area lately." She held her breath, counting the seconds. After what felt like an eternity, his footsteps retreated and the barn door closed with a decisive bang. Margaret waited another 5 minutes before emerging from her hiding place. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Amy. "How's the barn clean-out going? Need help this weekend?" The normalcy of the message felt surreal. How could she respond when her entire world had just shifted, when the man she'd loved and mourned might have been involved in something unthinkable? Margaret locked up the barn and drove home in a daze, the photographs burning like live coals in her pocket. Her house, their house, looked different somehow. The family photos lining the hallway seemed to mock her. David's reading chair by the window, still positioned exactly as he'd left it, now felt like evidence of a lie. She poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands and spread the photographs on the kitchen table. There were 5 in total, all showing the same young woman. Sarah at what looked like a county fair, laughing as she held cotton candy. Sarah by a lake, her blonde hair catching sunlight. Sarah in someone's living room, a room Margaret didn't recognize, curled up on a couch with a book. The intimacy of the photographs was undeniable. These weren't casual snapshots. Someone had cared enough about Sarah to capture these quiet, unguarded moments. Margaret pulled out her laptop and searched for old news articles about Sarah's disappearance. The girl had been 22, a recent college graduate working at a local bank. She'd vanished on a Friday evening after telling her roommate she was meeting someone for dinner. Her car was found 2 days later in the parking lot of Millers Creek State Park, keys still in the ignition. The investigation had focused on a troubled ex-boyfriend, but he'd had an alibi. There were mentions of other persons of interest, but no names were released to the public. The case had gone cold within 6 months. Margaret stared at David's handwriting on the back of one photograph until the letters blurred. "Love always D." When had he written that? Before Sarah's disappearance? After? The thought that followed was so horrifying she almost couldn't form it. Had David been the last person to see Sarah alive? Her phone rang, making her jump. The caller ID showed her sister's name. "Just calling to check on you." Ellen's voice was warm with concern. "You sounded strange yesterday." "I'm fine," Margaret lied, quickly gathering the photographs. "Just tired from all the sorting." "You don't have to do this alone, you know. David's been gone 2 years. Maybe it's time to consider selling that barn, moving on properly. Moving on, as if that were possible now, as if she could simply close her eyes to what she'd found and pretend her marriage had been what she'd always believed it to be. "I need to finish what I started," Margaret said quietly. After hanging up, she sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of both her husband and a girl who'd never had the chance to grow old. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled into the driveway of what had once been home for 37 years. The Tudor-style house looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of secrets she now carried. Eleanor's car was already there, parked at an angle that suggested her daughter's usual impatience. Inside, Eleanor was pacing the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors David had refinished just 2 years before his death. She turned when Margaret entered, her face flushed with anger and something else, fear, perhaps. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Detective Morrison called me asking questions about Dad, about some case from the 80s. Margaret set her purse down carefully, buying time. She'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but now the words felt inadequate. "Sit down, honey." "I don't want to sit down. I want answers." Eleanor's voice cracked. "Morrison said you found something in that barn, something about a murder." The word hung between them like a blade. Margaret moved to the mantel where David's photograph smiled down at them. The same smile she'd loved for 4 decades, now tainted with uncertainty. "There was a hidden room," Margaret began slowly, "with evidence. Police files, photographs, personal items that belonged to a girl named Rebecca Chen." Eleanor sank into David's old recliner without seeming to realize it. "Rebecca Chen? The college student who disappeared? Mom, that was God. That was before I was even born. I know." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Your father worked that case when he was young, before he made detective. So? That doesn't mean—" Eleanor stopped, her lawyer's mind catching up with the implications. "What kind of evidence?" Margaret closed her eyes, seeing again the horror of that hidden room. Crime scene photos that were never supposed to leave the station, Rebecca's student ID, and— She paused, the next words feeling like betrayal. "A letter from Detective Walsh to your father, talking about making the evidence disappear permanently." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock David had wound religiously every Sunday morning. "No." Eleanor's voice was flat. "No, Dad wouldn't do that. He was the most honest man I knew. He taught me that justice mattered more than anything else." Margaret wanted to agree, to find some explanation that would preserve the man they'd both loved, but the evidence was too damning, too specific. "There's more," she said reluctantly. "Financial records showing payments from someone named J. Chen, probably Rebecca's father, regular deposits into a savings account I never knew existed." Eleanor shot to her feet. "You're talking about my father like he was some corrupt cop taking bribes. This is insane." "Eleanor, I know how this sounds." "Do you? Do you really?" Eleanor's composure cracked completely. "Because it sounds like you're destroying everything I believed about the man who raised me, the man who walked me down the aisle, who held his grandchildren, who donated half his pension to that scholarship fund." Margaret felt the gulf widening between them with each word. "I'm trying to understand this too. I loved your father. I thought I knew him completely. And now some dusty old files in a barn are supposed to change that?" Eleanor grabbed her coat from the chair. "Maybe there's another explanation. Maybe Dad was investigating this on his own, trying to solve it. Then why hide the evidence? Why take money from the victim's family?" Eleanor stopped at the door, her back rigid. "I don't know, but I know my father, and this isn't him." After Eleanor left, Margaret wandered through the house like a ghost. Every room held memories that now felt suspect. The kitchen, where David had made her coffee every morning, had those same hands hidden evidence of murder. The bedroom where he'd held her during thunderstorms, had he lain awake thinking about Rebecca Chen. She found herself in David's study, a room she'd barely entered since his death. His police commendations lined one wall, 30 years of service awards and community recognition. At his desk, she pulled open drawers she'd never had reason to search before. Most contained the expected detritus of a long career, old case notes, departmental memos, retirement paperwork. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of field training manuals, she found a small metal box. Her fingers shook as she lifted the lid. Inside was a single photograph. Rebecca Chen, smiling and alive, standing next to a young man Margaret didn't recognize. But it was what was written on the back that made her blood freeze. In David's careful handwriting, "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I was young and scared and stupid. The money won't bring you back, but maybe it will help your family remember you lived." Margaret sank into David's chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. Here was confirmation and confession wrapped together, devastating in its simplicity. David hadn't just covered up Rebecca's murder, he'd lived with the guilt for 30 years, trying to pay for his silence with money that could never buy redemption. Outside, darkness fell across the quiet neighborhood, where she'd raised her children and built a life with a man she'd never really known at all. Margaret's hands trembled as she spread the photographs across her kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. Each image told a piece of the story she'd been desperately trying to avoid. Robert's younger face stared back at her from several shots. Him standing next to Detective Harrison outside the Whitmore house. Him shaking hands with Mayor Davidson. Him at what appeared to be some kind of civic meeting. But it was the final photograph that made her stomach lurch. Robert stood in a group of 5 men, all wearing somber expressions, positioned in front of the very barn she now owned. The date stamp read September 15, 1987, just 3 days after Sarah Whitmore's disappearance. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed her daughter's number. "Mom, you sound awful. Are you sick?" Emma's voice carried that familiar note of concern that made Margaret feel even more isolated in her discoveries. "Just tired, sweetheart. How are the kids?" "They're fine, but I'm worried about you. You've seemed so distant lately. Is this about the barn project? Maybe you should just hire someone to clean it out and be done with it." Margaret closed her eyes. If only it were that simple. "It's not the barn work. I'm just processing some things about your father." "What kind of things?" "Mom, you're starting to worry me." "Nothing specific. Just sorting through old memories while I go through his things. Maybe I should come help you. I could drive up this weekend." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I mean, that's sweet of you, but I need to do this myself." After hanging up, Margaret felt more alone than ever. She gathered the photographs and locked them in the small safe where she kept important documents, then poured herself a glass of wine and sat in Robert's old chair. The leather still smelled faintly of his cologne. She must have dozed off because the sound of gravel crunching in her driveway woke her. Through the window, she saw Detective Reynolds getting out of an unmarked sedan. Margaret's heart hammered as she smoothed her hair and went to answer the door. "Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the barn." "Of course. Please, come in." She led him to the living room, grateful she'd locked away the photographs. "Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be great. Thank you." As she busied herself in the kitchen, Reynolds called out, "I've been doing some research into the original investigation. Your husband's name came up several times in the files." Margaret's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "Oh?" He was quite involved in the search efforts. Volunteered his time, organized search parties. The community really rallied around the Whitmore family. She carried the coffee tray back to the living room, setting it down carefully to hide the slight tremor in her hands. Robert always believed in helping his neighbors. That's what everyone says about him. Salt of the earth type. Reynolds accepted the mug she offered. But here's what's interesting. The search effort stopped rather abruptly after about a week. The official line was that they'd exhausted all possibilities, but there were still areas that hadn't been thoroughly covered. I wouldn't know about the details. Robert didn't really discuss his volunteer work at home. Reynolds nodded, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. Mrs. Chen, in your exploration of the barn, have you come across anything else? Any documents, personal items, anything that might seem out of place? The question hung in the air between them. Margaret could feel the weight of the photographs locked in her safe, the newspaper clippings, the evidence that her husband had been far more involved in this case than anyone knew. Nothing that would interest the police, she said finally. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it felt like one. Reynolds studied her face for a long moment, then set down his mug. I understand this is difficult. If your husband was involved in something, even peripherally, that doesn't reflect on you. But if there's evidence that could help solve this case, could give the Whitmore family closure after all these years, I understand your position, Detective. If I find anything relevant, I'll certainly contact you. After he left, Margaret sat in the growing darkness of her living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. She thought about Sarah Whitmore, about a young woman whose life had been cut short, whose family had spent decades wondering what happened to her. Then she thought about Robert, about the life they'd built together, about the man she thought she'd known. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore, but she still wasn't ready to face what it meant. Margaret's hands trembled as she spread the photographs across her kitchen table, each image a piece of a puzzle she was no longer sure she wanted to complete. The barn's hidden room had yielded more secrets overnight. A manila envelope she'd missed in her initial shock, tucked behind the loose floorboard where she'd found the diary. The pictures were damning. Robert, younger but unmistakably him, standing beside a car with its trunk open. Another man she didn't recognize loading something heavy into the back, wrapped in what looked like a tarp. The timestamp on the back read September 15th, 1987, 2 days after Sarah Chen's disappearance. Her coffee grew cold as she studied each photograph with the detached precision of someone trying to distance themselves from their own life falling apart. In one image, Robert was checking his watch, his face tense with urgency. In another, he was speaking to someone just outside the frame, his mouth open mid-sentence, one hand raised as if giving directions. The sound of gravel crunching in her driveway made her heart leap. Margaret quickly gathered the photographs, shoving them into the envelope as Detective Morrison's car came into view through her kitchen window. She'd called him the night before, but seeing him now filled her with a paralyzing dread. Mrs. Holloway. Morrison removed his hat as she opened the door, his expression grave. You said you found something else? She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and led him to the kitchen. The envelope sat on the table like an accusation. Morrison's eyes went to it immediately. Before you look at those, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need you to understand something. I loved my husband. For 34 years I believed I knew him completely. Morrison's weathered face softened slightly. Mrs. Holloway, whatever's in there, it doesn't change who you are. She let out a bitter laugh. Doesn't it? How do you live with someone for over 3 decades and never know they were capable of… She couldn't finish the sentence. Morrison opened the envelope, his expression growing darker with each photograph. Margaret watched his face, seeing her own horror reflected there. When he finished, he set the pictures down carefully, as if they might explode. Where exactly did you find these? Same place as the diary. There was another hiding spot I missed initially. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. Detective Morrison, what am I supposed to do with this? How do I reconcile the man who brought me flowers every Friday with this? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs again. These don't necessarily prove murder, Mrs. Holloway, but they certainly raise questions about your husband's involvement in Sarah Chen's disappearance. Don't. Margaret's voice was sharp. Don't try to soften this for me. I can see what those pictures show. What I see is someone who might have helped cover up a crime. That's different from committing murder. Margaret thought about the diary entries, about Sarah's fear in those final weeks, about how Robert had been working late more frequently around that time. She'd attributed it to a big project at the firm, but now those memories took on a sinister cast. There's something else, she said reluctantly. The diary mentions someone named Charlie. Sarah was afraid of him, but she also mentions my husband trying to help her. What if Robert was trying to protect her and something went wrong? Morrison leaned back in his chair. Or what if this Charlie threatened your husband too, made him help dispose of evidence? The possibility hadn't occurred to Margaret, and she felt a desperate hope bloom in her chest before she ruthlessly squashed it. False hope would only make the truth harder to bear when it finally emerged. I need to know everything, she said firmly, even if it destroys every good memory I have of him. Morrison nodded. I'm going to have our forensics team go through that barn room again. These photographs might help us understand the timeline better. And Mrs. Holloway? He paused at the door. Consider staying somewhere else for a few days. If there are people still alive who were involved in this, your discoveries might have made you a target. After he left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of her old life. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets from her. She walked through rooms where she'd been happy, where she'd grieved her husband's death, where she'd planned a future that now seemed built on lies. In Robert's study, she opened his desk drawers one by one, searching for anything she might have missed. In the bottom drawer, behind old tax returns, her fingers found a small key she'd never seen before. It was old, brass, with numbers etched into the bow, 247. A safety deposit box, she realized. Another secret her husband had kept from her. Margaret pocketed the key, knowing that whatever it unlocked would likely shatter what remained of her world. Margaret's hands trembled as she spread the photographs across her kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. Each image told a story she wished she'd never discovered. Robert's handwriting filled the margins of the police reports, notes that should never have existed in a civilian's possession. The coffee in her mug had grown cold hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Detective Harrison's business card lay beside her phone, worn from her constant handling. One call would set everything in motion. One call would destroy the memory of the man she'd loved for 37 years. A soft knock at the back door made her jump. Through the window, she saw Ellen's concerned face peering in. Margaret quickly gathered the papers, shoving them into a manila folder before unlocking the door. "You look terrible," Ellen said, pushing past her into the kitchen. "I've been calling for 2 days. I've been busy with the barn." The lie came easily now. Ellen's sharp eyes swept the kitchen, landing on the folder. "What's that?" "Nothing important." Margaret clutched it tighter. "Just some of Robert's old work papers." "Margaret." Ellen's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd raised 5 children and could spot deception from across a county. "What's really going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. I saw you driving past the Harrison place yesterday, slowing down like you were casing the joint." The folder felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Margaret sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "Ellen, if you discovered something terrible about Jim, something that would change everything you thought you knew about your marriage, what would you do?" Ellen pulled out the opposite chair and sat down slowly. "That depends on how terrible. Terrible enough to destroy lives, terrible enough to send someone to prison. Jim's been dead for 8 years, honey. What could possibly matter now?" Margaret stared at her friend's weathered hands, remembering all the times those hands had comforted her, brought casseroles during Robert's illness, helped her plant flowers on his grave. Could she burden Ellen with this knowledge? Could she carry it alone? "The night Robert died," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He kept saying something about Jennifer. I thought it was delirium, but now—" She pulled out one of the photographs. "I think he was trying to confess." Ellen leaned forward, studying the image of a young woman's face. Even in black and white, Jennifer Holloway's beauty was striking. Her smile radiated the kind of confidence that came from being 19 and believing the world held infinite possibilities. "She disappeared in 1987, Margaret continued. "From the barn I bought, the barn Robert specifically told me never to touch." The color drained from Ellen's face. "Margaret, you can't be serious. I found a hidden room, evidence that was never turned over to police. reports with Robert's handwriting all over them. Her voice cracked. I think he helped cover up her murder. Ellen was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but strained. You said someone would go to prison. Robert's gone. Who else? I don't know yet. But someone killed that girl, and Robert helped hide it. The question is who else was involved. Margaret pulled out another document, this one showing a property deed. Look at this. The barn was sold 3 times between 1987 and when I bought it. Same buyer each time, using different company names. Ellen studied the papers with the meticulousness she'd once applied to balancing the farm's books. These signatures look familiar. That's what I thought. Margaret pointed to a scrawled signature at the bottom of one deed. Does that look like Charles Hoffman's handwriting to you? Ellen nodded grimly. Charles Hoffman had been Robert's partner in the construction business, a man who'd grown wealthy developing half the county, a man who still held considerable power in local politics. If Charles was involved and Robert knew, Ellen trailed off. Then Robert spent 36 years keeping a murderer's secret. The words tasted bitter in Margaret's mouth. All those nights he couldn't sleep. All those times I caught him staring out the window like he was watching for something. I thought it was just stress from work. Ellen reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. What are you going to do? Margaret looked at Detective Harrison's card again. I keep thinking about Jennifer's mother. Imagine spending 36 years not knowing what happened to your child. Imagine dying without ever knowing the truth. And imagine learning that the man you loved was complicit in that suffering. The two women sat in silence as the afternoon light faded outside. Finally, Ellen spoke again. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But Margaret, once you make that call, there's no going back. Are you prepared for that? Margaret picked up the phone, her finger hovering over the numbers. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the evening train whistle, the same sound that had marked the end of each day for decades. Tonight, it felt like a countdown. The manila envelope trembled in Margaret's hands as she sat in her car outside the police station. 3 hours had passed since she'd made the call to Detective Reynolds, 3 hours of pacing her kitchen and rehearsing what she would say. Now, with Thomas's confession letter burning against her fingers, the weight of 30 years pressed down on her chest. The station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows through the windows as she finally forced herself to walk inside. Detective Reynolds appeared almost immediately, his expression unreadable as he guided her to a small conference room that smelled of stale coffee and disappointment. Mrs. Coleman, he said, settling into the chair across from her. You sounded upset on the phone. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. She placed the envelope on the scratched table between them, her wedding ring catching the overhead light. I found this hidden in Thomas's study, behind a false panel I never knew existed. Reynolds opened the envelope with careful precision, his eyes scanning the handwritten pages. Margaret watched his face change as he read, saw the moment when professional interest shifted to something darker. Jesus, he muttered, then looked up at her with what might have been sympathy. How long have you known about this? I found it yesterday morning. Her voice came out as a whisper. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I keep thinking about that girl in the barn, about her family never knowing what happened to her. Reynolds set the letter down and leaned back in his chair. According to this, your husband didn't kill Sarah Chen. He says he found her body and helped dispose of it to protect someone else. But he doesn't say who. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. 30 years, detective. I lived with this man for 30 years, and I never knew he was capable of something like this. The letter mentions a phone call that night. Someone contacted him, panicked, asking for help. Reynolds tapped the paper with his pen. Do you have any idea who that might have been? Margaret shook her head, then stopped. A memory surfaced unbidden. Thomas on the phone late one night early in their marriage, his voice low and urgent. She'd asked about it the next morning, but he'd brushed off her concerns, claiming it was work-related stress. There might be something, she said slowly. Phone records from 1994. If they still exist, we can check. Reynolds made a note on his pad. Mrs. Coleman, I need to ask, are you prepared for where this investigation might lead? If we reopen this case, everything will come out. Your husband's involvement, his reputation, your family's privacy. The question hung in the air between them. Margaret thought of her children, now adults with families of their own. She thought of Thomas's colleagues who still spoke of him with reverence, of the scholarship fund established in his name. All of it would crumble once the truth emerged. But then she thought of the photograph she'd found in that hidden room. Sarah Chen's young face, bright with possibility that had been stolen away. She thought of parents who might still be alive, still wondering what had happened to their daughter. That girl deserves justice, Margaret said, her voice stronger now. Her family deserves to know the truth. Reynolds nodded approvingly. There's something else. We found additional evidence in the barn yesterday, fibers that don't match anything from the original scene. They were caught on a nail near where the body was hidden. If we can find the clothing they came from, you could identify who moved her there. Exactly. He paused, studying her face. I have to ask, Mrs. Coleman, is there anything else you're not telling me? Any other secrets your husband might have been keeping? Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She thought of the safety deposit box key she'd found with the letter, still sitting on her kitchen counter. She'd been too afraid to use it, terrified of what other revelations might be waiting. There's a key, she admitted, to a safety deposit box I didn't know existed. I couldn't bring myself to look. Reynolds leaned forward. Would you be willing to check that box, with me present? The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Margaret realized she was at a crossroads. She could still retreat, could claim she'd found nothing and let the dead rest. Or she could continue down this path, knowing it would destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. Yes, she said finally. But I want to see Sarah's parents first. If they're still alive, if it's possible, I need to look them in the eye and tell them I'm sorry for what my husband did. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. That's not standard procedure. Nothing about this is standard. Margaret stood, feeling steadier than she had in days. I'll get that key and meet you at the bank tomorrow morning, but first I need to make this right with her family. Outside, the afternoon sun felt different on her skin, cleaner somehow, as if confession had burned away years of unknowing complicity. The rain hammered against the kitchen windows as Margaret sat at her table, surrounded by decades of lies laid bare in yellowed documents and faded photographs. The manila envelope James had hidden behind their wedding photo contained everything: police reports with altered dates, witness statements that had been mysteriously misfiled, and most damning of all, a letter in her husband's handwriting, addressed to someone named Vincent Carrera. The girl's death was unfortunate, but we've handled it. The barn will remain sealed, and the official report will reflect what we discussed. Your continued cooperation ensures this stays buried, as does your family's safety. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words again. 23 years of marriage, and she'd never known the man sleeping beside her. The James who brought her coffee in bed, who cried at their daughter's graduation, who held her through her mother's funeral, that same man had orchestrated a cover-up that let a killer walk free. Her phone buzzed. Detective Morrison's name flashed on the screen. Mrs. Chen, I need you to listen carefully. We've been monitoring Vincent Carrera since our last conversation, and he's on the move. Our surveillance team lost him 2 hours ago, but his last known location was heading toward your area. The words hit her like ice water. You think he's coming here? I think a man who's kept a secret for 30 years might be desperate to keep it buried. Are you somewhere safe? Margaret glanced around her empty house, suddenly aware of every shadow, every creak of settling wood. I'm at home. Should I? Pack a bag. Right now. Don't take time to think about it. There's a motel on Highway 9 called the Pine Rest. Check in under the name Sarah Williams and wait for my call. But as Margaret stood to move, headlights swept across her front window. A dark sedan crept slowly down her street, moving too deliberately to be a casual passerby. The car paused in front of her house before continuing to the corner, where it turned around and began another slow approach. He's here, she whispered into the phone. There's a car outside. Stay on the line. I'm dispatching units to your location, but they're 15 minutes out. Is there a back exit? Margaret crept toward the rear of the house, clutching the envelope of evidence against her chest. Through her kitchen window, she could see the barn looming in the darkness, its bulk a reminder of where this all began. The irony wasn't lost on her. She might have to hide in the very place where Sarah Martinez had met her end. The front doorknob rattled. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she realized she'd forgotten to engage the deadbolt after Morrison's earlier visit. The handle turned slowly, and she heard the soft whisper of the door opening. "Mrs. Chen?" A man's voice, gravelly and unfamiliar, drifted through her house. "I just want to talk about some old business concerning your late husband." She slipped out the back door as quietly as possible, grateful for the rain that would mask her footsteps. The envelope pressed against her ribs as she ran across the muddy yard toward the barn. Behind her, she could hear the man moving through her house, his footsteps growing more urgent as he realized she wasn't there. The barn door stood slightly ajar, and Margaret slipped inside, pulling it closed behind her. The familiar smell of decay and old wood surrounded her, but now it carried new meaning. This wasn't just her storage space anymore. It was Sarah's tomb, and possibly her own. Her phone vibrated with a text from Morrison, "Units, 3 minutes out. Stay hidden." Through the gaps in the barn's siding, she could see a flashlight beam sweeping across her backyard. Vincent Carrera, if that's who this was, had discovered her escape route. The light moved steadily toward the barn, and Margaret realized she had perhaps 30 seconds before he reached her hiding spot. She thought of the hidden room where Sarah's body had been found, but that space was too small, too obvious. Instead, she climbed the rickety ladder to the barn's loft, praying the old wood would hold her weight. James's stored belongings created a maze of shadows above, boxes of his police files, old furniture draped with sheets, a lifetime of accumulation that now served as her only protection. The barn door creaked open below. "I know you're in here, Margaret." Vincent's voice was closer now, almost conversational. "Your husband was a smart man, but he made one mistake. He kept insurance, evidence that could destroy both of us if it came to light. I'm assuming you found it." Margaret pressed herself behind a stack of James's boxes, the envelope clutched so tightly her knuckles ached. In the distance she could hear the faint wail of sirens, but they seemed impossibly far away. The flashlight beam began probing the loft. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast everything in harsh relief as Margaret sat across from Detective Harrison, the manila folder between them thick with decades of secrets. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched him flip through the photographs she'd brought, images that painted her late husband David in a light she'd never imagined possible. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand the gravity of what you're telling me," Harrison said, his voice measured but intense. "You're alleging that your husband was involved in covering up the murder of Sarah Hendricks in 1987. Margaret nodded, though the words still felt surreal leaving her lips. The evidence was all there, hidden in that room. David's handwriting on the notes, his business card tucked behind Sarah's photograph. He knew about her death, and he helped hide it. Harrison studied a particular photograph, the one showing Sarah's jewelry arranged on the wooden table. "This locket, you said it belonged to the victim." "Sarah Hendricks, yes. I found newspaper clippings about her disappearance. She was only 19. Margaret's voice caught. "I keep thinking about her parents, how they never knew what happened to their daughter." The detective leaned back in his chair. "We've been reviewing the original missing persons file. Sarah Hendricks was last seen leaving her job at Henderson Construction Company. Your husband worked there too, didn't he?" The connection hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd known David worked construction in his 20s before he'd moved into project management, but she'd never thought to connect it to Sarah's case. Yes, but he was just a junior project manager then. Surely he wouldn't have had the authority to cover up something like this. "Maybe not alone," Harrison said grimly, "but the Henderson family had significant influence in this town. Old money, political connections." If something happened to Sarah that implicated the company or someone important, they might have needed help making it disappear. Margaret thought of the careful way the evidence had been preserved in that hidden room, almost like a shrine. David kept everything. Even after all these years, he kept it all. Why would someone do that if they were just following orders? Guilt, Harrison said simply, or insurance. Sometimes people hold on to evidence as protection in case they need leverage later. A new thought struck Margaret, cold and terrible. Detective, my husband died of a heart attack 6 months ago. Very sudden, very unexpected. He was in perfect health. Harrison's expression sharpened. What are you suggesting? I don't know. Maybe nothing. But the timing. What if someone found out he still had that evidence? What if they were afraid he might finally talk? The detective made a note in his file. We'll look into it. In the meantime, I need to ask, is there anyone who might have known about your husband's involvement? Anyone who's approached you since his death? Margaret thought immediately of the phone calls, the feeling of being watched. There have been some strange calls, hang-ups mostly, and yesterday I found my front gate open when I was sure I'd locked it. Mrs. Chen, I think you should consider staying somewhere else for a few days while we investigate this. If someone killed your husband to keep him quiet, and they find out you've discovered the evidence. The implication hung heavy in the air. Margaret pulled her coat tighter around herself. I can't just run away. Sarah Hendricks deserves justice. Her family deserves to know the truth. I understand, but... Harrison's phone rang, interrupting him. He answered curtly, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When he hung up, he looked at Margaret with new urgency. That was the lab. We rushed the analysis on some of the evidence you brought in. The blood on that shirt? It's a match for Sarah Hendricks' DNA from her dental records. Margaret felt the room spin slightly. Despite everything, part of her had hoped there might be some innocent explanation. So it's real. David really was involved in covering up her murder. It appears so. But Mrs. Chen, there's something else. The lab found recent fingerprints on some of the evidence. Prints that don't match yours or your husband's. The cold fear that had been building in Margaret's chest crystallized into terror. Someone else has been in that room. Recently, within the last few weeks. Harrison stood up. I'm arranging for protection for you immediately, and I want that barn secured as a crime scene. As they prepared to leave, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Whoever had killed Sarah Hendricks 36 years ago was still out there, still covering their tracks. And now they knew that Margaret had found their carefully hidden secrets. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they walked toward the exit, casting shifting shadows that seemed to follow them down the hall. The sheriff's car pulled into Margaret's driveway at exactly 9 in the morning, just as she'd requested. Through her kitchen window, she watched Detective Sarah Chen step out, followed by Sheriff Williams. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured coffee into 3 mugs, the ceramic clinking against the counter. She'd spent the entire night organizing everything, the photographs, the newspaper clippings, the blood-stained clothing, and most damning of all, Robert's journal entries. Each piece of evidence sat in neat piles on her dining room table, like an indictment of the man she'd loved for 37 years. The doorbell rang, and Margaret smoothed her cardigan before answering. Detective Chen's expression was gentle but alert, while Sheriff Williams looked skeptical, as if this might be another dead-end tip from a grieving widow. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, leading them inside. "I know this must seem strange, but I found something in the barn that I think you need to see." Detective Chen's eyes immediately went to the dining room table. "What exactly are we looking at, Mrs. Hoffman?" Margaret took a steadying breath. "Evidence. About the Sarah Beth Morrison case." Sheriff Williams's skepticism vanished instantly. He moved toward the table, his eyes scanning the carefully arranged items. "Where did you find all this?" "There's a hidden room in the barn, behind a false wall." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "Robert built it. I found his construction notes." Detective Chen picked up one of the photographs, a young woman with dark hair laughing at a carnival, completely unaware that this moment would be frozen forever as evidence in her murder case. This is definitely Sarah Beth. We only had her driver's license photo and a few family snapshots in the original file. How long have you known about this? Sheriff Williams asked, his tone sharper now. I found it 3 days ago. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. I've been trying to process it all. My husband, Robert, was involved in covering this up. Detective Chen set down the photograph and picked up Robert's journal, flipping to the pages Margaret had marked with yellow sticky notes. The detective read silently, her expression growing more serious with each passage. He writes here about cleaning up Tommy's mess and making sure no one finds out, Detective Chen said. Who's Tommy? Margaret's chest tightened. Thomas Brennan. He was Robert's best friend since childhood. They served in Vietnam together. She paused, gathering strength. Tommy died in a car accident in 1987. Robert always said it was because he'd been drinking, but now I wonder. Sheriff Williams was examining the plastic bag containing the bloodied clothing. This needs to go to the lab immediately. DNA testing might finally give us answers. There's more. Margaret stood and walked to her purse, withdrawing a small velvet jewelry box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a heart pendant. I found this hidden in Robert's toolbox last night. There's an inscription on the back. Detective Chen took the necklace and turned over the pendant. To Sarah, love, Mom. This was probably mentioned in the missing persons report. It was, Sheriff Williams confirmed grimly. Her mother said Sarah never took it off. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Margaret felt as if she were watching her marriage dissolve before her eyes. 37 years of memories now tainted by this terrible secret. Mrs. Hoffman, Detective Chen said gently, I need to ask some difficult questions. Did your husband ever mention Sarah Beth Morrison? Ever act strangely around anniversaries of her disappearance? Margaret thought back, sifting through decades of shared life. Every year in October, Robert would get moody and drink more than usual. He said it reminded him of losing friends in the war, but October was when she disappeared, wasn't it? October 15th, 1976, Sheriff Williams confirmed. And there were phone calls, Margaret continued, the memories becoming clearer now. Late-night calls where Robert would take the phone outside. He said they were work-related, but they happened for years after he retired. Detective Chen and Sheriff Williams exchanged glances. We'll need to examine the hidden room ourselves, Detective Chen said. And we'll have to process your barn as a crime scene. Margaret nodded, having expected this. I understand. I just want the truth to come out. Sarah Beth's family deserves to know what happened to her. This is going to become public knowledge, Sheriff Williams warned. Your husband's name will be connected to this case. Are you prepared for that? Margaret looked at the evidence spread across her table. The final, devastating legacy of the man she'd thought she knew completely. Robert made his choices 47 years ago. Now I'm making mine. Detective Chen began carefully placing the evidence into official bags while Sheriff Williams called for a forensics team. Margaret watched them work, feeling simultaneously empty and resolved. Tomorrow, she would have to call her children and tell them their father had helped cover up a murder. But tonight, Sarah Beth Morrison would finally have justice. Margaret stood at the edge of the ravine where they'd found Danny Kowalski's remains, watching the forensics team finish their work. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, and she pulled her jacket tighter against the autumn chill. Detective Rivera approached, his expression grave but relieved. The dental records confirm it, he said quietly. Danny Kowalski, age 16 when he disappeared. The coroner estimates he's been here for 43 years. She nodded, unsurprised, but still feeling the weight of finality. In her hands, she clutched the manila envelope that contained Frank's confession letter. The one she'd found hidden behind their wedding photo after Detective Chen's visit. The letter that explained everything and shattered the last of her illusions about the man she'd loved for 37 years. Mrs. Brennan, Rivera continued. "I know this has been incredibly difficult. Your husband's letter provides crucial evidence that will finally give the Kowalski family closure." Margaret watched as the forensics photographer documented the scene one final time. Frank wrote that Danny threatened to expose the illegal gambling operation at Murphy's warehouse, said he had evidence that could send them all to prison. Her voice was steady now, though it had taken her 3 sleepless nights to reach this point of acceptance. Frank was just 19, working there part-time to pay for community college. When Murphy and his associates decided Danny had to be silenced, Frank got pulled into it. "The letter indicates your husband didn't participate in the actual murder." "No," Margaret agreed, remembering Frank's anguished words written in his familiar handwriting. "But he helped move the body. Murphy threatened to kill Frank's younger sister if he didn't cooperate. Frank spent the rest of his life carrying that guilt." Rivera glanced at his notes. According to the confession, Murphy paid Frank to buy the barn property years later, specifically because they knew the body was nearby. Murphy wanted someone he could trust to own the land, to make sure it was never developed or thoroughly searched. Margaret finally understood why Frank had been so adamant about keeping the barn, why he'd grown agitated whenever she mentioned selling it or having it renovated. She'd attributed it to sentimental attachment, but it had been fear and guilt eating away at him for decades. "The statute of limitations has expired for accessory charges," Rivera said gently, "and Mr. Murphy died 8 years ago, but Danny's family deserves to know what happened to their son." "I'm going to tell them myself," Margaret said, "before the news breaks publicly. They've waited 43 years for answers." An hour later, Margaret sat in the small living room of the Kowalski family home, facing Danny's elderly parents and his younger sister, now a woman in her 50s. The walls were filled with photos of Danny, his school pictures, his baseball team photos, images frozen in time of a boy who never got the chance to grow up. "We always hoped," Mrs. Kowalski said, after Margaret finished explaining. "Even when we knew in our hearts he was gone, we hoped maybe he'd run away, started a new life somewhere. But knowing for certain, it's somehow a relief." Danny's father, now 81 and frail, wiped his eyes with shaking hands. "That Murphy was a cancer on this neighborhood. We suspected he was involved, but we could never prove it. The police investigation went nowhere. Your husband carried this burden for 4 decades, Danny's sister added. "I can't imagine what that must have done to him." Margaret thought about Frank's final years, how he'd grown increasingly withdrawn, how he'd started drinking more heavily, how he'd sometimes stare out the window for hours. She'd attributed it to work stress and middle age, never suspecting the dark secret that was consuming him. Frank wanted to confess many times, Margaret said, sharing what she'd read in his letter. But he was terrified of what Murphy might do, even as they both got older. Murphy had connections, people who would have hurt Frank's family, our family, if he'd spoken up. As she drove home, Margaret reflected on how completely her understanding of her life had shifted. The man she'd thought she knew had been carrying this enormous secret, had been paying for the barn property as a form of penance, had been dying slowly under the weight of his guilt and fear. But she also understood now why Frank had been so devoted to community service in his later years, why he'd volunteered at the youth center and donated quietly to victim advocacy groups. He'd been trying to atone in the only way he knew how. Margaret pulled into her driveway and looked at the barn for what would be the last time. She'd already contacted a real estate agent. The property would be sold, the building demolished. She couldn't bear to keep it, knowing what she now knew. But somehow, despite everything, she found she could forgive Frank. He'd been a frightened teenager trapped in an impossible situation, and he'd spent the rest of his life trying to live with honor, even while carrying his shame in silence.